Sure. Why don't we go ahead? Hey, Jovan. Okay. So we're going to talk tonight about, is it okay to go ahead and get started?
Oh,
Then
I'm sorry. Yes, I feel like we all know you, so I didn't do.
no, you're good. So I'm Lisa Kusman, and we're going to talk about milestones and their impact on learning. And we originally did this presentation to really try to drive home the point about why some of those developmental milestones are important and what are the reasons why kids may or may not go through those and what we might see happening from those. So we'll start here. Kind of our objectives tonight really are just to go through what those developmental milestones are. We're going to talk a bit about sensory processing. I'm an OT, so sensory is what I talk about most probably. And then we're going to talk about kind of some things to look for and red flags that you might watch out for. Okay, so developmental milestones. Really, when babies are first coming home from the hospital, mostly they are able to kind of lay there and start to pull their hands and feet to midline, and that's sort of the base point of what where we're starting at. Um, Obviously, if you have a child that has more physical things going on, that might be harder. But in a neurotypical baby, that is what you're going to see. And then they're going to start rolling over and shifting to their tummy and lifting their head. So this is just kind of an overall view about what's happening in those first few months with that developmental process. And then we'll go into it a little bit more. And then I do like at 6 months how it's like blah, blah, blah. um, so let's kind of look at that a little more closely. So you lay baby down on the floor, especially at just a couple months old, and they're going to start, they're looking around, right? They're looking at the fans, they're looking at the things above them. And so, what that is starting to work on is that visual tracking. So, their eyes are starting to come together to look at an isolated spot above them. And then they might start turning their head and they're working on that visual scanning. What happens then is their both eyes are coming together. So anytime we look at one point, both of our eyes come together and focus on that one point. And so babies are starting to do that at such an early age. And it's not perfect, it's not refined at that point, but they're starting to develop those eye movements. We also see them starting to work against gravity. So rather than just lying flat on the floor, they're pulling their hands to midline. And then they see their hands at midline and they start to kind of move around. They're also starting to pick their legs up against midline, which then begins to work on that core strength. So all of these things are happening just when that baby's laying in supine. It's part of the reason, and we'll talk a lot tonight about why it's important to let babies be on their own and not be in a supported device all of the time because it doesn't allow for that freedom of movement. We also are starting, they're working on that reflex integration. So when we're born, when our babies are born, they in even before they're born in utero, the amniotic fluid is moving around and the mother is moving around and the baby's head might start to turn, and then they go into what we call an ATNR pose. So their head turns and they bend one arm and straighten the other, and they're starting then to push against the amniotic sac, and it is beginning to build muscle tone. It's beginning to build strength and work through those reflexes. And so that all of that reflex integration is starting at that really young age too. Um, we talked about core flexion while they're lifting their legs, and then they start kind of moving their head around and lifting their head, and we get a little bit of neck flexion. And they're also starting to work on joint stability in this position and shoulder strengthening because their arms are kind of hanging out against gravity. And then they start working on hand eye coordination. So they realize you put something in their hand and they realize something's in their hand and they're moving it around and following it with their eyes. And so that hand eye coordination begins to develop as, we're talking at, 1 or 2 months old when this is happening. And then they're feeling everything, hopefully. They're reaching for different toys, they're feeling different textures. And so, and they're doing that with their hands and their feet and on their cheeks. And so we want to get them exposed to all of that tactile input in that, just in that supine position. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, right? Okay. So they start rolling, they're moving from side to side, and maybe they start to roll over, or maybe before they're doing it, we're still placing them in tummy time. And we hear that tummy time is important, but why? Why is it important? Why are we looking at that so much? So on when they're on their bellies in that prone position, and a baby has to lift their head up against gravity. Now they're working on all of their extensor muscles, right? And they're pulling up against gravity and starting to look around. And so they're developing their visual system in a totally different way than when they're just lying flat and lying supine. So they're working on just holding themselves up and turning their head and coordinating those visual tracking and visual convergence and focusing in on an object. Um, in prone, we start to develop, like I said, all those extensor muscles. And so they're pulling up, they're getting more input in their shoulders and in their hips. And so all of those extensor muscles are developing, which is going to give them the strength for sitting and standing and walking. But kids sometimes avoid that tummy time. And so we're going to talk about what we see when that happens. So, in this position, the baby's hands are on the floor or the rug or the blanket or wherever they are, and they're starting to develop even more that tactile perception. So they are feeling things. They're kind of, a lot of times we'll see them kind of grasping and raking and pulling things toward them, which obviously further develops those fine motor and grasping skills. So much is happening in this prone position. Another thing that I think is really interesting is when I went to a course years and years and years ago, and they were talking about this, and it was sort of an aha moment for me. But when the babies are in that prone position, the floor is against them. And so their muscles have to work against gravity to continue those breaths. And so what we start to see then is a further development of their core and postural system, but then also their respiratory skills. So they are getting stronger, and their breathing skills are getting better as well, which I think this is really interesting because so many kids that we evaluate at leaps and bounds who are struggling with emotional regulation have a lot of respiratory difficulties. And so it's another reason why tummy time is so important. It's regulating in itself because it gives them all of that pressure, but it's also developing those respiratory skills, which I didn't think about initially until somebody was talking to me about it, and I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so also bilateral coordination, because they're moving their arms back and forth, and they're having to move both sides of their body, and they're kicking their legs back and forth when they're in this position. So we're really looking at that bilateral piece. Again, like I talked about, joint stability in their shoulders and in their hips, and then working on that weight shift. So in this position, you'll see them kind of shift to one side and then the other side, which develops that part of that bilateral coordination as well. Okay, crawling. So the world changes when they start crawling, and then again when they start walking, right? So more visual perceptual awareness and more visual perceptual skills are being developed. So because they're moving, so now things aren't stationary or moving toward them, they are moving and having to coordinate their visual field with the environment that's around them. So they might focus in on an object and crawl to the object. So we're working on depth perception, we're working on divergence and convergence in the visual system. So this crawling piece is really important for that. It enhances those postural skills that they've already started to develop, because as they crawl, they're using those reciprocal movements. So they're shifting from side to side and developing those postural skills. Additional neck extension is happening because they have to lift up even higher to get their hands on the floor and move. Um, lots of tactile perception is happening in this stage, and I think that's, one of the most important things that's happening during crawling. I if so as so they're crawling on different surfaces and being exposed to that. I do see some of our kids that struggle with sensory issues, maybe tactile issues. They might crawl, but maybe they do it in a fist. And so they crawl like this so that they don't have to be open and experience all of those stimuli. So those are some things that we watch out for and try to figure out, why are they performing this skill in that way? And is there, what's the reason and can we help them with that? What also develops, obviously, it makes sense, but your fine motor skills are developing during crawling as well. Because when you place your hand on a flat surface and then move, all of those intrinsic muscles, or you're pushing through those little muscles of the hand. And so you're developing finger strength and those arches in your hands. I've definitely had lots of kids over the years that you can feel that there's no contour to their hands. Their hands are very flat and sometimes kind of squishy. And a lot of times, you go back and connect the dots, and these kids had tactile difficulties and avoided crawling because of that. And so, it's you can kind of connect the dots and make things, go back to where those skills broke down a little bit. Um, Additional joint stability in the shoulders and the hips, and in the elbows as they're pushing through. So that stability is going to give them it's going to obviously strengthen their system, but give them the support that they're going to need when they have to sit and do writing tasks or sit for long periods of time. And the weight shift that we talked about before, that's happening here too, and the reciprocal movements, and then all of that hip flexion as well. Okay, so why do some kids skip crawling? Because I'm guessing, do you guys see that in your with PAT? You see that happening sometimes. Yeah. So, different reasons. And so maybe kids are avoiding crawling, and they just go right from sitting and pulling up to walking. And sometimes that can happen, and there might not be any developmental ramifications from that. Maybe it's just, how your child is developing. But there often are reasons why that's happening. And so we just want to look at that and make sure that we're covering all the bases. But sometimes kids skip crawling because they're sensitive. And so they will avoid putting their hands or maybe even their knees or legs or feet on the floor. So you might see a child that, sometimes their parents will say, oh, yeah, they crawled. But then when you break down what that crawling looked like, it might have just been like scooting on the floor, or the kids develop some sort of I've seen so many different ways to crawl that aren't exactly crawling at all, because they just figure out what works for them, and in a way that they can avoid that tactile input. So I want to look at, are they choosing to either crawl in a way that is different than we would expect, or are they skipping crawling as a result of their sensitivity of tactile input? So that's one reason that kids might skip crawling. They might skip crawling because it's hard. That motor planning and control is really tricky. And so you might see kids that get up in that quadruped position and are rocking, but just can't quite plan how to move one side of their body separately from the other. So they might just not crawl because of that. Or postural control issues. Maybe they're not strong enough in their core to develop those movements. So sometimes we'll see kids that just sort of like, make it up. So they're holding onto the couch and they like make it up to standing somehow. And then they just look like tree trunks, and their legs are sort of going sideways and kind of flopping around, and they look unsteady all the time. And a lot of our kids will continue to look unsteady even after they've been walking for several months, because they don't have that strong base of support. So that's something to kind of keep an eye out. Reflux issues. We've got lots of kids that have reflux issues. So tummy time and quadruped are uncomfortable or causing that reflux to happen. And so we might see that kids have reflux, they avoid tummy time, and we see later some issues afterwards. And so we like to work with parents to figure out what's the best way to get that input for that child that works for them and their reflux issues. um, and then poor social attentiveness. So maybe you have a child that is not interested in their environment. They're not interested in imitating movements, and they're not interested in, they're not aware of what's going on socially. And so they might tend to isolate themselves a little bit more and just not be interested in interacting with the environment in the same way that another child will. And so they might skip crawling for that reason. So, for all of those things, if I have a child that comes into leaps and bounds at 6, 7 years old, and we're noticing some of these things, we often are going to try to put them in positions that are playful and are engaging, but that they're going to go through and build some of that muscle strength, or focus on processing that tactile input so that we can get them through some of those foundational skills. So skipping any one of those developmental milestones can impact the way that their brain develops, because neurologically we're meant to go through those type of milestones. It doesn't mean there's going to be some giant hole in their learning, or but it's just it you know it's we're just looking for that foundation and trying to get that as stable as we can. And so we just want to kind of keep an eye out and be proactive rather than reactive, right? Okay. Oh, it's not. There we go. Okay. Let's talk about sensory processing. So we process sensory information. How we describe that is a three-step process. So our bodies take in the sensory information. Our brains make sense of that, and then our bodies produce a response. And so for tactile information, our bodies get tactile information all over our skin. We have all these tactile receptors, and our bodies make sense of that. So if somebody taps me on the shoulder and I'm not looking, I can right away take a look and know that they're tapping me on my left shoulder. For some kids, a tap on their shoulder can be interpreted as really as a noxious stimuli. So maybe it's painful, maybe it's scary to them. And so their response is going to be different than just mine, where I might turn my head. Their response might be that they push somebody away, or that they jerk their arm away because it's painful. And so for sensory processing, we're looking at when we're evaluating that, we're looking at all of those responses and trying to make some sense about, using our clinical judgment to try to make sense of how they're processing that information. Because obviously you're going to approach life and you're going to learn differently if you're not experiencing any of these sensory systems in a way that makes sense for other people. So we'll look at tactile, visual, smell and taste, auditory, vestibular, and proprioceptive senses. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about each of those. My slides are not advancing. There we go. Okay. Signs of inefficient visual processing. So, our visual system gives us information, obviously, about the things we see around us. And for so many kids, it is obviously you go to the eye doctor and they tell you if you have what your vision is, if you have 20/20, or if you need glasses or need it corrected in some way. But and so that's a piece of vision. So that's acuity. But we often are looking at how well does our brain process that visual information, which is different than visual acuity. So we might have, so that happens all the time. Parents will come in and we'll say, are there any visual difficulties? And they're like, oh no, he's 20/20. But kids can have perfect vision, but have trouble processing that visual, all of the visual information they're seeing. So we might have kids that are sensitive to lights, like they squint or they blink or they cover their eyes, or the transition from indoors to outdoors is really stressful. So they're covering and maybe even avoiding going outside because of that. Kids that we might see that they have poor reading skills or writing or math skills, distractibility, their eye contact might not be great, and handwriting might be an issue, and they might have difficulty with like puzzles and finding things in a background. So if they're struggling with visual processing, then the way that they learn and that they approach skills in their environment is going to they're going to have a different experience. Auditory information. So in the same way that we want for kids obviously to have 20/20 vision or 20/20 corrected vision, we want for them to be able to see, um, but if they and so same for auditory. So we want for them to have hearing that gives them enough information that they can hear what's going on in their environment, but that's different than how well their brain is processing that information. So we might see that if kids are struggling with auditory processing, we might see that they are slow to respond to their name or directions, or they have difficulty with those multi-step directions. Distractibility, I always make the joke, distractibility is on every slide. So if you have a distractible child, then you still have to figure out why they're distracted, but it could be a sign that there's some auditory issues. You might have kids that are sensitive to sounds. So the automatic toilets that flush can be really hard for kids. Anytime there's a fire alarm, which obviously can be alerting to anybody, but there are kids that when that fire and you know the kids, but when that fire alarm goes off, if they haven't been prepped, it can cause a meltdown that could impact them throughout the day. So those kids that are really sensitive to sounds, I kind of use it as an example that, um, when there's stuff going on in the environment, your brain just sort of filters it out. It filters out maybe some of the overhead lighting noise, the little buzz that happens with that. It might filter out the clock. It might filter out the air conditioner when it pops on. But for so many of our kids, they just tune into all of those tiny little noises. And then when they're supposed to be paying attention to directions or what the teacher is saying or their parents are saying, it becomes really difficult for them. So I have to really focus to do that. Um, so it's stressful to have to do that all day long, every day. Other signs that there's trouble with auditory processing, maybe kids are, like I said, distracted by background sounds, and we also see speech and articulation difficulties. It's not a direct correlation where if they have speech or articulation difficulties, they have auditory processing difficulties. We don't, that doesn't happen. There's a correlation, but it's not a direct correlation. Or if kids have auditory processing, it doesn't mean that they are going to have speech or articulation difficulties. It's just, they just go together. It's hard to produce if you're not taking in information in an accurate way. It's hard to sometimes produce those sounds. Okay, tactile processing. So, if kids are having difficulty processing tactile information, we might see some things like, these are things that pop up if you Google, you're going to see, are they irritated by tags in the clothing? And that could be, it's not for every kid, but that could happen. Or irritated by like the seams in their socks, or maybe they're kids that just avoid wearing shoes and socks, or, they might dislike being hugged or touched unexpectedly. They might hit a peer because of that light touch, like I described earlier, because that light touch is where we might feel like it's not alerting, it's not negative. They might feel it in a different way. Or if kids are avoiding getting their hands messy, which we see sometimes preschool is usually there's lots of tactile experiences um, in daycares and preschools. And if you have kids that are really avoiding that, it could be a sign that there's some tactile processing. If I always remember on the tactile slide to say this, but if also if you have a kid that is the kid that's like all in the paint. The paint is everywhere. The paint is on the hands, it's on the face, on the up the nose, or the mud is everywhere. Those are kids that may have some tactile processing difficulties too. So with any of the systems, it can go one way or the other way, and we want them to be somewhere in the middle. But it's important to note it could be the child that is avoiding getting messy, or the kid that is um, always messy all the time. I had a little boy that I did an observation with, and he was in a preschool, and they were doing some activities, and he was kind of like he was all over his seat and falling out of his chair. And then he raised his hand to go to the bathroom. And so his teacher let him go to the bathroom. And I'm doing this observation. So I'm sort of following him. I felt a little creepy, but I was following him to see what was happening. And he goes in the bathroom, and I'm just waiting for, and he doesn't know that I'm following him or wait. He's completely unaware that that's happening. And he goes in the bathroom, and I wait outside, and then he comes out several minutes later, and his pants are twisted. His underwear is up over top of his shirt. Both pockets are out. And I think his shirt was inside out too. Like, I don't even know what he was doing in there, but he was like fine. It didn't bother him at all. But to me, if that going on, I would be bothered by my pants being twisted. And so he is a kid with tactile processing difficulties. But and he's not avoiding anything. So he's in the middle of he's all over that gets all messy and everything. Um, so other things we might notice, kids that have trouble with transitions. Uh, Transition trouble can happen for a few different reasons, but a lot of kids, there's some tactile difficulties when there are transitions. And we look at that because, like, every transition is a whole different set of sensory experiences, right? So if they go in the classroom from the carpet to a chair, or they're just going to standing in line, there's just all different kinds of tactile experiences. And so sometimes it's easier for kids just to kind of stay in their zone, do their own thing, and not experience all of those. All right. Okay. Proprioceptive processing. So we have proprioceptors in all of our muscles and joints, and they give us information about movement. And so when so like if I always use the example, if I pick up my glass of water, I can look at it and I know that it's a glass. I know it even looks a little cloudy because the ice has melted. So I know it's going to be cold. And I can predict without picking it up, I can predict about how many muscles to recruit to pick it up and what it's going to feel like. Um, but if I am not getting good feedback from my proprioceptive system, I might go to grab it and totally knock my glass over, or I might go to pick it up and realize it's heavier than I thought and I'm going to have to adjust. Or I might pick it up and go to drink it and spill water everywhere because I'm not grading my movements effectively. So often these kids are noticed, and because of that clumsiness and awkwardness, they're falling, they're spilling, and so those are the kinds of things that require additional adult help. Those are the things that are getting noticed. So other areas that we might see if kids are not processing proprioceptive input effectively, structured motor tasks are going to be hard because it's harder to get your muscles to do the things that you're supposed to be doing. And so it's those kinds of things are tough. You might see that kids are bumping into things frequently, or like I said, learning new motor tasks, especially new fine motor tasks are hard. Kids might seem weaker than other children or get really tired easily. They might be your kids that are like moving nonstop, but then you ask them to sit in a chair for 2 minutes and they're like falling out of the chair because it's hard to sustain those muscles in a sustained movement. You know, it's different than when you're just constantly moving. So you might have kids that are really wiggly. They might drool because keeping their mouth in a closed mouth posture, which is our resting posture, is hard for some kids sometimes. So it might be kind of more open mouth, and so they might have some issues with drool. We might see that they're mouthing or chewing on non-food objects a lot. They're just seeking more of that input, or their pencil or crayon grasp might be awkward or not, they might have trouble developing that. We might also see that they have really increased pencil pressure, or crayon, or when they're coloring, they are fisting and they're like pushing really, really hard. And so those are things that, might be signs that they have trouble with proprioceptive processing. I always use the example that it's not a, they should standardize this at some way, but those kids where you're like, give me a high five, and they like back up so far and try to like take your arm off. Those are, I feel like that's that's like a assessment, right? Or the kids that you go to give me a high five and it's just really light. That doesn't happen as much as those really heavy kids, right? But they just need more input and they have trouble. They also might be the kids that are kind of seen as like they don't know their own strength. You hear that term, that they are just not that they're trying to push other kids down, but they just really can't grade those movements. And so they might be seen as playing really rough, or cause kids to get hurt, which then socially can be really hard for them.
They're the bull in a china shop kids.
Yes, they are. That is them, you're right.
I had a student years ago, a little girl who she was totally the crasher. I mean, crash, 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 everything, just intense movements constantly. And it was so interesting to see the whole "where's my body in space" part, because she would go on the platform swing and she would want to swing, she would work to swing, and then literally she would fall apart because it was like we had to put her body back together. Like I
Wow.
would hold her and squeeze her, roll her in a beanbag just for her to like feel grounded and feel where she was at. It was so interesting to see all
Yeah,
of those pieces come together.
right, and you can kind of see that happening in a session. Yeah. Yeah, our kids this happens all the time, like, kids will jump up and they land on their knees, like, in the school on the school floor, which is really hard, but they're just seeking so much of that, they have to keep crashing. Okay, vestibular processing. So our vestibular system is our movement system. So it's located in our inner ear and it gives us information about movement and balance. And so when we have difficulty with this system, we might see that kids are just moving constantly, or they're on the other end where they're very sedentary and not seeking that movement. So we obviously want to be somewhere in the middle. We want kids moving and playing, but when the moving gets so that it interferes with learning and play, then obviously we look at that. So kids that have difficulty with vestibular processing might spin, they might do like seek a lot of really intense kind of movement. Or like I said, they might be kids that avoid that. They don't get on the swings. They tend to play by themselves, rather than be involved in chase games or games on the playground. They might also, that climbing at the risk of their own safety is often something that we see too. They're the kids that are climbing on the couch and flipping, and the parents are maybe nervous at first, and then it's like, oh, they do that all the time. The kids that are just nonstop moving. Um, they also might be kids that have trouble identifying right and left sides of their body. So, our vestibular system, since it's located in our inner ear, it's on both sides. And so, we have information that's being translated through our brain on both right and left sides of the body. And so, when we have information that's not being processed effectively, then sometimes we see difficulty with right and left sides as well. But there typically are kids that like parents are saying they're nonstop, they're always on the move. Or when maybe when we're doing the evaluation, even though I know that they're listening and I know that they are attending to what I'm saying, they just cannot stop their bodies from moving. So they're trying to follow directions, but their bodies just keep moving. Um, Okay, so this I like to use this as kind of just a visual description of what we're talking about. So that sensory system is foundational, and then all of those really beginner milestone things are part of that foundation as well. It doesn't mean that if you have difficulty with tactile information, you can't do daily living activities or you can't participate in academic learning, but it just makes it harder. When your base is not as stable as it could be, then it makes it harder to learn and to pay attention, to do eye hand coordination activities. So those are like I said, it just makes it more difficult. It doesn't mean that can't happen. And our bodies and our brains are really great about finding adaptations, which is sometimes makes our job a little harder because the kids just figure out how to adapt and change. But you want to go back to the foundation of what's going on. But I thought this was a good visual just to kind of really look at why we are looking at that nervous system and our sensory system so much, because it's just really foundational to all of that learning. It's like sometimes it wants to change and sometimes not. Okay, so when should I be concerned? um I Oh, I didn't know I did that fancy transition. um, I love this quote. It's from Mr. Rogers, who's just like, a pretty amazing guy. But play is the work of childhood. So I people always say, like, an occupational therapist, what are you doing? What kind of work are kids doing? Well, they're doing a lot of work. Their work is play and learning. And so what as an occupational therapist, that's what we are focused on when their skills are when play is interrupted and they're not able to develop their skills, then that's where we come in. So I think, I mean, obviously, in many settings, you have to have a certain percentage of delay and have all of these concerns in order to qualify. It's really one of the reasons we started Leaps and Bounds is we work really hard to figure out what's going on with that child and how to help you justify services if it's warranted for your kid. And so really, when are you concerned, when do you get help? It's when their job is to play and learn, and it's when they're not able to perform that function. So if you have a child that is struggling because there's so many tactile difficulties that they're not able to have a nutritious diet. They're not able to interact with their friends. They're not able to tolerate wearing clothing or putting shoes on in the morning. Those are things that are interrupting their function in their day. And so I always tell parents, trust your gut, because a lot of times a parent is going to be thinking about it or worried about it before another professional might. But also, what you have to figure out what's working for your family. So I always go back to function. So if a parent says, well, I looked at all of the things you're talking about, and yeah, my kid has some tactile difficulties, and yeah, my kid has some vestibular difficulties, but school's going well, home life is good, they have friends, they're participating in sports, um, but should I still be worried? And I'm like, if it's not getting in the way of their function, then that's awesome. But if there's a point in which it starts getting in the way of them doing the things and participating in life in the way that they should be, then that's usually when I recommend it. I feel like that's more cut and dry than XYZ, all these milestones, all these things. It's, trust your parent gut.
I think that's so great though, because my youngest son, he is a hot mess. Sensory wise, I mean, he is just all over the place, and exhibits quite a few things that I spotted early on,
Mhm.
but it doesn't impact those other it doesn't impact the play. It doesn't, I just know he's going to be a disaster, like afterward, and I just embrace that. And that's just what it is. But so I think that's a great way to explain it, how you did. So.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we all have sensory things going on, right? We all have areas in our life that we could work on. And so it's just about how we learn and how we adapt and what accommodations we make for ourselves. Um, so yeah, when it impacts function is when I recommend kind of seeking out some additional help. There we go. Okay, so I just put a list of some resources. I put us on there, but also parents as teacher programs. And parents as teacher programs are, you know, often the people that are in there screening and evaluating before anybody else lays their eyes on that child. And so they are such a great resource. And um, I'd like to say too, I mean, doctors are, it's important to have a doctor you feel like you can talk to and you can express everything to. But most of the time, the doctors are looking at, is this child, are their height and weight looking good? Are the parents reporting anything? And if the parents are like, I think, they're eating okay, they're learning to toilet train, if the family is expressing that everything is going okay, then the doctors often they're not with the child long enough to really see some of those difficulties at times. And so I think sometimes it's good to get your doctor on board with what you're doing, but it also is important that parents just educate themselves and know what resources are available so that they can make decisions that make sense for them. I put First Steps on here for kids 0 to 3. And First Steps is a really great resource, but also can only help kids that have a certain percentage of delay. And so if your kid falls sort of in that, on that borderline where they don't qualify, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to get services if you feel like that would be helpful for your kid. It just means that you might not be able to access services through them. And so, I'm always an advocate for being proactive and really trying to get early intervention if that makes sense for you, as opposed to a wait and see approach. Um, we have a lot of play therapists that we work with, and play therapists can be really helpful for working through some things. Our behavior specialists. We also, at times, will refer to chiropractic or allergists or counselors. And so there's this list could go on and on. There's lots of different professionals that you can seek out for those resources. What I have found is that parents, when they have kids that maybe are not reaching their milestones or maybe have some sensory processing difficulties, it's hard to know where to go for that kind of thing. And sometimes you're not ready to think that your child needs therapy at that point too. And so that can be a stigma to kind of work through. But I mean, it's our goal at Leaps and Bounds that we are a resource for families. And if as a resource, it's that you seek therapy through us or we can help connect you with the right fit, then that's our goal and our mission to be able to do that. I think that's the best thing. And parents are the experts on their own kids. And so you should be able to make decisions that are going to fit your family and your child. One more. All right. Do you guys have any questions?
So I was just going to say, I didn't want to interrupt earlier, but it's so incredible to see, just those stages and that tummy time. And I know when you're going through it with your own children and you're at the pediatrician, sorry, my boys are.
You're fine.
But they push tummy time. And I just really feel that it's not pushed enough. They ask about it, but they don't really, they don't train you on the why part of it. And I feel like if parents could see, 5 years down the line, what not doing tummy time, what that looks like in a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old. You would definitely push more and try to work on that tummy time. So just as a teacher, please, please, please do tummy time. Please work on it. And uncomfortable is not bad. Like, just because it's uncomfortable does not mean that they're in pain or anything like that. It's just what it is. It's just uncomfortable. So,
Building muscle. I mean, I'm not comfortable at the gym a lot of times.
right. Right. Exactly. So just as much as parents can find fun, creative ways to do that. And like, if they say, like what our rule in my classroom is, if you're going to lay on your belly, your elbows are up. That's just it. You don't have a choice, because if not, you're, face planting on the floor. And so if they say like, okay, I'm done, I'm like, oh, perfect. Let's wait one more minute. To like just push them just a little bit longer. But it's incredible to see the correlation between not being able to sit up in your own chair, leaning on the table, and then into writing and putting stuff up on a wall, like so many things. So anyway, big push for tummy time.
I know. Well, and you saying that reminded me too. I didn't really talk about all of we have so many devices that the kids can sit in and lay in, and that doesn't it all their when they're in the like a pumpkin seat or a carrier or a stroller, they're just in a passive flexion position. So there's really not a lot of active movement happening there. Or like the bumbo seats, I'm going to talk bad about the bumbo seats for a second, but they were made to kind of help kids sit up. And if your kid is not ready to sit up, then they're going to be in those bumbo seats where their hips are in a really tilted, like passive flexion movement, and they're just sort of like hunched over. So it's not good positioning. And the exercisers and things like that, not that all of them are bad, but just having some balance. So those exercisers, if you've got a kid just sitting on the fabric, then it can kind of pull apart the muscles from their pubis bone, and it can cause them to have more trouble with standing and joint stability. So all of those, in moderation, I think any of them can be fine, but just being really cognizant. I mean, if you don't know, then you don't know. And you just, they have all of these things as an option. And as a parent, you think you have to get all the things, but sometimes no things are better.
And I think it might have been you, Lisa. I think it was one of our virtual parent groups where tummy time was mentioned, and it was, if there is an acid reflux or something really uncomfortable for those kiddos, then even just the parent reclining and having the baby on top of their chest and managing that tummy time, even just a little bit like that can be really helpful. So I was like, never really thought about it.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. Okay, you guys. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you inviting me to chat, and I always love talking with you guys.
Absolutely.
Can I do a little plug for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So
yes, go Tara.
Amazing. I literally just love listening to you talk, because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. Oh, this is so great. So anyway, so thanks for presenting. And then on either our website, which is connected to the parents. Oh, sorry, Barfield. I work at Barfield Early Childhood for Winsville. And then Addie for Parents as Teachers. So either website will connect you to our library that has been put together. And so Lisa also has an amazing presentation on food. So a lot of these kiddos that we might have been talking about tonight, that would also be another great presentation to check out. So anyway, Leaps and Bounds, not all outside companies are a big fan of working with, but I absolutely love working with Leaps and Bounds. So you do a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate it, you guys.
I was going to say Leaps and Bounds is usually the first resource out of my mouth if we're talking about, PT, OT, anything. I go, have you checked into Leaps and Bounds? So Again, you guys are amazing. Thank you so much for being a part of this and giving this talk. And yes, the picky eating talk was amazing as well.
Awesome.
So much information.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you
Bye.
guys. Bye-bye.